Hello, this week we are starting our exploration of women's labor issues. And I've actually decided to retitle this lecture Bread and Roses. This is the activist tool strike, and we're going to learn a lot about um, the role of women in the United States as unionism and collective bargaining are taking off in the early 1900s. And I'll tell you a little bit about why I chose Bread and Roses when we get to that part. Um, Now, you do need to know that the whole idea of collective bargaining does actually have Marxist origins. And I know when I say that, it has a lot of loaded baggage. But really, the important thing for you to know about Marxism at this stage is that it's a critique of classical economics. So, classical economics, which is Adam Smith and which is authored by Adam Smith, and probably most of what you'll learn if you take economics, says that wages are negotiated freely between employers and employees, and that one of the beauties of the free market is that they will always come to an efficient resolution. If the wages are too low, workers simply won't work. If the wages are too high, then there will be downward pressure, thus you get an efficient outcome. Marxist economics takes issue with that and says, no, actually, employers and employees have completely oppositional interests. And they're engaged in a constant struggle over wages, and it's really a struggle over resources and who has access to them. And the recommendations that come out of that perspective are for collective bargaining over wages and conditions. So the idea is that it's not actually a free negotiation. Workers have a lot less power than the employers in determining wages. And in fact, the employers are setting wages and pressing them lower and lower. The only way that workers will actually be able to negotiate with them or increase their access to wealth and even make a living for themselves is to unite and point out to employers that really it cannot be done without them. And that's what a strike really is. It's a tool for exerting worker power. It's a way of telling the employers, oh, hey, wait, look, you actually need us to continue to do work. If we all get together and refuse to work, then you will have to raise wages. It's very different than going to an employer individually, in which case an employer can say, well, get out of here, I'll find somebody else who will do it for that cheap. And women have actually a long history of being leaders, particularly in the 1900s when one of the big issues was child labor. So the first little historical walk I want to take you on is called the March of the Mill Children. Now, and this is related to children working in mills in the early 1900s in Philadelphia. You know, there were, at the time, if it's hard to imagine, no laws restricting child labor, no laws restricting the number of hours anyone could work in a week, and no regulations on wages and conditions. So you had children working 16, 17 hours a day, very unsafe conditions without ventilation. It would get extremely hot in these mills. Um, and that was, and those were the conditions that led to this particular strike. Now, Mother Jones, who's one of our YouTube videos, but I don't think anyone selected it yet, was a union leader at the time. And you can see right here, she says, someday the workers will take possession of your city hall. She's talking about Philadelphia. And when we do, no child will be sacrificed on the altar of profit. And what she actually did was led a group of striking women and children. The historical estimates vary. It's somewhere between 46,000 people and 100,000 people, depending on the estimate. I know that's a huge gap, but either way, it's actually a huge number of people. Let's even suppose that the median 75 or so is how many thousands of people were striking. That's a huge number of people. The city of Philadelphia's mill industry is brought to a screeching halt, and they start on a 2-week journey from Philadelphia to New York, where they actually go to demand and the march is a really good way to draw a lot of attention to your cause, because you can build up your media coverage over the course of many weeks, and build the anticipation. When you get to wherever you're going, then that's when you have the big rally. But after the rally in New York, Mother Jones actually continued on to Theodore Roosevelt, who was then president, summer house, and presented him with a letter demanding, and get ready for it, because this will tell you a lot about the working conditions of the time. She was demanding things like a 55-hour work week and no night work for women and children. Those were the demands, okay? So imagine how incredibly oppressive those conditions were. Unfortunately, she was never seen by the president, but as the labor movement and especially the movement against child labor started to take place, the momentum started to build. They got coverage, and it led to a lot of further strikes. For example, the Lawrence strike, March 1912, so almost a decade later. Lawrence was a mill town, okay, and it was, as the story is with many mill towns, horrible working conditions, very hot, long hours, and then in 1912, the factory cut pay. And that resulted in a massive strike of women, and also in the first picket line in the United States. So a picket line is, it's part of a strike, but in addition to the refusal to work, you actually picket back and forth in front of the door of your employer so that no one can come in or out without having to listen to your demands. And you also prevent your employer from hiring scabs or replacement workers who will break the strike because they'll do it for less, and everyone will be forced back to work. So that's one of the pieces of, that's how strikes often look. And the reason that I titled this lecture Bread and Roses is from a song that actually was the rallying cry of this march, but still is an important rallying cry today, and a song that has been replayed again and again. And I'm going to read you the lyrics of the poem that was written in, I think, 1911, year before. Although the phrase Bread and Roses is from a 1905 speech, just letting you know. Okay, and it goes, as we go marching, marching in the beauty of the day, 1,000,000 darkened kitchens, 1,000 mill lofts gray, are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sun discloses, for the people hear us singing, bread and roses, bread and roses. As we come marching, marching, we battle too for men, for they are in the struggle, and together we shall win. Our days shall not be sweated from birth until life closes. Hearts starve as well as bodies. Give us bread, give us roses. As we come marching, marching, unnumbered women dead go crying through our singing their ancient call for bread. Small art and love and beauty their trudging spirits knew. Yes, it is bread we fight for, but we fight for roses too. As we go marching, marching, we're standing proud and tall. The rising of the women means the rising of us all. No more the drudge and idler, ten that toil while where one reposes, but a sharing of life's glories. Bread and roses, bread and roses. And so the reason that they talked about both bread and roses, bread is really the basic necessities of life that they lacked access to, but roses is also this idea that we can share in, it's not enough for us to just subsist and just have enough to eat, right? We should all be able to share in the wonderful things in the world and in the fruits of our labor that we're producing, when in reality, employers are keeping a lot of the money. And you can listen to the Joan Baez version. It's definitely worth a listen after you watch this recording. Now, these are all related to the conditions out east, where you're talking about a large number of women in textile mills and other types of factories doing small work, but it's basically a factory situation. When you move out west, the role of women is very different, because then you're talking about a heavy presence of the mining industry, especially in Colorado. And the situation for women is frequently that then, rather than the factory, even women who aren't working, who are the miners' wives, are really subject to the company in a lot of ways because they're living in company housing. And so you have the whole family really living under the company and the whole family involved whenever there's a strike. And some of you may know where I'm going with this, and some of you may not. But one of the most famous strikes in Colorado history, and unfortunately, one of the most violent strikes in Colorado history, was at Ludlow. Now, in September 1913, coal miners who were working for the Colorado Fuel and Iron Corporation attempted to join the United Mine Workers Union. In response, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Corporation, owned by the Rockefellers, who did not want to raise wages, decided they would break the strike by evicting the miners from company housing. Now, instead, with the support of United Mine Workers, the miners and their families moved to a nearby tent city to continue the strike. They continued picketing. They continued to disrupt business as usual. And round about the turn of the new year in spring, the company decided that they'd had enough of that, and they decided that they were going to use violence and break the strike no matter what it took. The dark part of this is that they actually contracted the Colorado National Guard. The Rockefellers paid their salaries for them to go into the tent cities and break the strike. And on April 20th, 1914, the National Guardsmen actually set fire to the tent cities, including the underground shelters that the miners had built for their families so that their families would be safe from any violence that was coming. And they actually shot the women and children as they were running away. It is one of the worst pieces of Colorado history that I know of, although certainly, we could start talking also about the violent oppression of Native American people, and that would lead us to I think, similar conclusions about the way that the government is actually used in violence. And that was a moment, I think, for many where they said, wow, the government actually will support the corporations, not the people, and not the people's right to protest or demand wages. And so when you think about that in the future, and you think about the struggle for access to collective bargaining today, that's a history to remember. Okay, and I want to close by giving you a couple of hopefully positive resources of what's going on today. There is actually a Bread and Roses Cultural Center in Denver. It is still associated with the International, Industrial Workers of the World, which was the union that the Lawrence Mill strike was associated with also. So they are still around, and you can check it out. And then the one that I think is really big right now is the Fast Food Workers Union and the Fight for 15. The Fight for $15 an hour really does strike a lot of people. The vast majority of people who are making minimum wage are women. The vast majority of the poor in this country are women. And $15 an hour is a number that that unions have said, and policy papers have demonstrated you could actually live on and support a family on, as opposed to the current minimum wage. And so, actually, there's been quite a lot of continued activism in that area. Just a year and a half ago, a group of fast food workers laid across Colfax, blocked it for the entire lunch shift to raise awareness for their cause. So go check out the Fight for 15 or the Bread and Roses Workers Cultural Center, and think about this idea of whether the current system is fair or whether we do in fact need collective bargaining. Now, some would say that government regulation, bringing to $15 an hour, would also help. But when we remember Ludlow, I think, doubt maybe what the government will do unless workers really truly get involved and unite and get their voice together. And I will see you for part 2, consciousness raising.